Welcome to this explainer. Okay, so today we're going to decode something absolutely fascinating. We're looking at a deeply personal, mathematically structured biographical manifesto. And honestly, it's just an incredible exploration of how music, deep trauma, and the long road to healing all intertwine in the human experience. The author of this text has essentially taken the absolute sheer chaos of their life. We're talking intense personal crises, massive political awakenings, and a very severe mental health breakdown, and they've organized all of that into a beautifully symmetrical 12-track playlist. But, we really need to take a second and understand what building a manifesto out of a playlist actually means in practice. This isn't just a casual collection of your favorite summer songs you throw on for a road trip, right? No, this is an actual structural scaffolding for sanity. When life feels like an endless, terrifying freefall, mapping your lived experiences onto audio tracks allows you to pause, it lets you rewind, it lets you categorize the overwhelming rush of existence into something manageable. It's a remarkably unique way of processing the world. The author is literally charting their descent into a severe psychosis and then their grueling but ultimately triumphant ascent back to self-empowerment. So in this explainer, we are going to unpack exactly how this architectural approach to memory and music works and how translating your trauma into a track list can basically become the ultimate tool for survival. Let's get into it. Looking at this, the sheer complexity of the author's mind becomes immediately evident. Just look at how they connect these deeply charged political concepts, things like anti-fascism, with this profound, almost radical sense of personal empathy, respect, and inclusion. It's like a giant puzzle. The author is navigating a world that we all know is filled with intense polarization, right? Yet, they are constantly seeking human connection over division. So the big question here, and it's one we probably all ask ourselves, is how do we hold on to our core ideals in such a fragmented, hyper-political society while still leaving enough room to genuinely understand the people who fiercely disagree with us? This is the massive underlying tension at the very heart of this manifesto. The visual chaos of everyday life. All those intersecting, messy lines of family dynamics, ideology, art, and just basic survival is exactly what the author is attempting to tame and structure here. It's all about taking these massive, sometimes totally overwhelming societal themes and grounding them in lived, highly personal, everyday experiences. It's a monumental task of sense-making. They are basically trying to turn the deafening noise of the modern world into a decipherable, steady rhythm that you can actually dance to.
So, think of this agenda as the actual track list for our journey today. First, die Symmetrie des Manifests. Second, Jugend, Musik und Identität. Third, Kultur und spirituelle Grenzerfahrungen. Fourth, der Wendepunkt, die Psychose. Fifth, Innerarbeit und Heilung. And finally, number 6, Manifestation der Vision.
Okay, starting off with Section 1, Die Symmetrie des Manifest, or the architecture of the playlist. We're going to begin by uncovering the hidden structural symmetry that holds this entire biographical narrative together. Now this is where things get really interesting. The sheer mathematical precision of how the author mapped out their life is just fascinating. The author structured their lived experiences like a perfectly mirrored playlist, specifically zooming in on tracks 12 through 23 of a much larger 33-track overarching manifesto. And the key here is the mirror. Each track that marks a descent in their life systematically reflects a track of recovery later on. So, track 12 perfectly mirrors track 22. Track 13 mirrors 21, track 14 mirrors 20, and so on and so forth, progressively closing in on the absolute center. And right there, at the very core of this mathematical structure, we have track 17, which is Marusha's Somewhere Over the Rainbow. That track stands entirely alone as the solitary pivot point of the entire ordeal. It's the bottom of the V, so to speak. Finally, after the ascent is complete, track 23 serves as the ultimate exit, finally breaking that mirrored loop and pushing the narrative forward into the future. Now, you might be thinking, okay, cool, a symmetrical playlist. But this symmetry isn't just an aesthetic choice. It's not just a fun little musical quirk. It's actually a profound psychological coping mechanism. Think about it. Trauma often feels endless, right? It feels chaotic and unstructured. But by ensuring that every single negative experience or descent has an equal, opposite, and symmetrical reaction of healing and ascent, the author is essentially creating a psychological safety net for themselves. It is a literal promise to oneself that no matter how far down the rabbit hole you go, there is a corresponding, mathematically certain step waiting on the other side to bring you right back up to the surface. It's brilliant.
Moving on to Section 2, Jugend, Musik und Identität, or Building the Foundation. Let's dive right into those foundational tracks, covering the author's early life, their career struggles, and how their core identity was forged.
Tied directly to track 12, which is The Funk by MZNZI, and moving into track 13, we find this incredibly beautiful piece of carpentry. This is a Gesellenstuk, basically a journeyman's piece for a carpenter. Now, this table is so much more than just wood and glue. It marks an early, massive triumph over a severe personal crisis in the author's life. After going through a totally devastating breakup, the author actually started skipping work. They stopped going to vocational school, and they were slipping into this really dangerous, heavy apathy. But then, an uncle, who was an architect, suddenly stepped in. He essentially forced a return to focus and personally helped design this magnificent table. You can imagine, right? The physical grounding act of building something so precise, so sturdy, served as this perfect, tangible metaphor for rebuilding oneself. It physically symbolizes a closed circle of recovery. But, and here is where the story gets super complex, there is a deep, palpable tension described in this era of their life. The immense pride the author felt in this physical craftsmanship is starkly juxtaposed against a growing, painful ideological divide with their father, who at the time was drifting toward conservative, right-wing politics. So the familial unit was ideologically crumbling at the exact same moment the author was learning to physically build things up. It's a striking contrast. The author actually neutrally pairs this really complex, bittersweet emotional memory with MZNZI's track, Mietspiegel, which is a heavily left-wing, socially critical song. Doing this perfectly encapsulates those contrasting, pushing and pulling forces that were actively shaping their early worldview. It firmly places the author right in the middle of these opposing societal structures, just desperately trying to find their balance.
As we progress further up the playlist to tracks 14 and 15, which feature Cascada and Duck Sauce, the narrative shifts pretty dramatically. We move out of a carefree childhood, where the author was actually a highly praised, super agile soccer goalie locally known as the Cat, and we transition right into the turbulent years of puberty and ultimately adult club culture. A really beautiful connection was made at the Garbage Festival over what's called dark disco music. This part of the text really illustrates how a sweaty, crowded dance floor can essentially transform into a genuine spiritual sanctuary for people. The author heavily emphasizes the strict, albeit unwritten rules of this specific culture. For example, you don't just stand there and stare at the DJ as if they are some kind of god on a stage. Instead, you turn around and interact with the community dancing around you. It's definitely not about individual worship, it is entirely about collective liberation. The author writes about friends playing these underground ghost sets at festivals and how those moments taught them what true tolerance actually looks and feels like in everyday practice. It was about breaking down those rigid, suffocating societal boundaries, which directly led to deep, lasting friendships, particularly within the gay community. So music here is completely elevated. It goes from being mere background sound in a room into the actual load-bearing architecture of their social identity. It is literally where they learned how to exist peacefully and joyfully alongside other people.
Now, the author brilliantly uses these cultural and musical moments to take a step back and impartially observe the mechanics of what we call the Streisand effect in broader society. If you're not familiar, this is that well-documented phenomenon where attempting to hide, remove, or censor a piece of information inevitably leads to massive, totally unintended attention being drawn to that exact same information. It always backfires, right? The author observes this happening across vastly different spectrums of life. On one end of the scale, they look at global finance, specifically pointing out how the Swiss bank Julius Baer attempted to scrub critical Wikipedia entries about themselves, which of course only resulted in intense worldwide scrutiny. Then, on the totally opposite end of the spectrum, they examine regional politics and culture. They note how attempts to silence controversial musicians like Danger Dan, or how the really aggressive pushback against the highly controversial activist group Breaking the Silence amidst the tragic Israeli-Palestinian conflict, only serve to amplify those critical messages. The author isn't taking a side here, they are simply pointing out a mechanical truth of our modern information age, and that truth is forceful attempts by powerful institutions to suppress voices almost always backfire, turbocharging the very message they desperately wanted to hide in the first place. It's just a fascinating observation on how power and information actually flow.
All right, Section 3, Kultur and spirituelle Grenzerfahrungen, or Across Borders. The narrative really accelerates rapidly here as the author travels internationally, experiencing some incredibly intense cultural exchanges and spiritual awakenings.
Let me set the scene for this next part because it's a profound moment of cross-cultural connection that happens during a major skateboarding contest in Copenhagen, the CPH Pro. The author was actually living in an apartment with a group of Israeli skaters. To earn their keep, they were acting as the house chef, cooking massive steaming pots of bolognese, basically getting free rent in exchange for feeding everyone. And it just goes to show how food and sport act as these universal languages that totally bypass traditional national borders. Anyway, one day, during a random street conversation with a French-speaking Swiss skate crew, there was this confusing, multifaceted language barrier happening. Everyone was speaking different languages. One of the Israeli skaters, Jimmy, turned to his friends and joked in Hebrew, saying, "Brother, I don't understand anything." The author, who had been quietly picking up the language and caught the Hebrew amidst all the linguistic chaos on the street, just casually replied in Hebrew, "Me neither." Jimmy stopped, smiled, and said this amazing quote, "I really love when you understand us talking Hebrew." It is such a small, fleeting anecdote, but it powerfully highlights how shared passions, like skateboarding, eating a good meal, just traveling together, can transcend strict national and linguistic definitions. It created this deep, entirely unexpected bond right there in the middle of a busy European street.
As we move deeper into the author's time spent in Israel, they have to navigate some highly complex cultural nuances. And again, they report impartially on the tension between strict European political correctness and the actual lived reality of an Israeli dance floor. For instance, they describe this one scene with a white hip-hop DJ named DJ Krunji who wears cornrows. Now, obviously, that's a hairstyle that is heavily scrutinized in Western Europe and America as cultural appropriation. But in this specific local Israeli context, it was wholly embraced. During the party, the diverse crowd was openly and enthusiastically singing the N-word along with the rap lyrics pumping from the speakers. The author notes that, as a German who is raised and steeped in a very different, highly specific discourse regarding historical guilt and language, they felt this intense cognitive dissonance. They felt real discomfort, and they ultimately chose not to sing along just to maintain their own personal internal boundaries. However, and this is the key takeaway, they neutrally observed the incredibly liberating feeling that was present in that specific room. It was a crowd completely ignoring strict academic political correctness in favor of raw, lived liberation and a shared unifying musical energy. It is a really nuanced, fascinating examination of how geography, history, and immediate context can entirely shift the moral weight of our language and actions.
So all these intense cultural experiences and travels eventually trigger a profound, majorly boundary-pushing spiritual awakening for the author. This is tied to a friend named Lior, whose name beautifully translates to "my light." The author ends up having an absolutely overwhelming LSD experience at the Sea of Galilee. It got to be too much, so having to step away from a loud, pulsing party, they went and sat alone on the quiet beach for 4 hours. They were just sitting there, simply running the sand through their fingers. And in that highly altered, heightened sensory state, they felt this massive, entirely unorthodox connection to the historical figure of Jesus. They began to merge this historical, religious presence with a new persona that they mentally named Julius Hoffman. Now, Julius Hoffman is this chaotic but deeply meaningful blend of the author's own name, the famous judge from the Chicago 7 trial, and the LSD inventor Albert Hoffman. It's a wild combination, right? During this trip, they even spent time deeply reflecting on a fringe theory proposed by a Chinese scientist. This theory suggested that Jesus' ability to walk on water wasn't a magical, divine miracle, but rather the brilliant engineering of a master carpenter who figured out how to use thick wooden shoes wrapped in rubber tubes just beneath the water's surface to float. It is a beautiful, if totally chaotic blending of history, theology, deep friendship, and psychedelics. It represents a human mind stretching to its absolute, very limits to try and create new meaning out of the complex world around it.
Which brings us to Section 4, Der Wendepunkt, the psychosis, or the crash in Palma. Because, as you might guess, all of these compounding spiritual and cultural boundary pushes eventually demand a toll. This leads directly to the central crisis of the manifesto. This perfect storm of events creates a very clear, tragic, step-by-step descent into a severe psychosis while the author was living in Palma. The real tragedy here is that it all actually started as a highly calculated, well-intentioned plan. Step 1. They were microdosing mushrooms Monday through Friday specifically to boost creativity and focus for their projects. But then, in the critical third week, we hit Step 2. The author skipped the mandatory weekend break. Your brain needs time to rest, and they skipped it. Step 3. When you combine that chemical disruption with a past history of recreational party drugs, and then layer on a newly massive, completely uncharacteristic consumption of heavy hashish, the psychological grounding just completely dissolved. Step 4. Complete isolation. The everyday routines that keep us tethered to reality vanished. They stopped cooking their meals, they stopped doing their yoga, they stopped even going outside to feel the sun on their face. The mind entirely detached, which leads to Step 5. Developing a terrifying tunnel vision. The author launched into relentless, endless monologues to try and explain their grand, sprawling projects to friends, effectively trapping themselves in an isolated mental bubble where nobody could reach them. And adding to the profound trauma of literally losing one's mind, they experienced what they describe as gaslighting from their own family.
Their family accused them of taking massive, reckless doses of hard drugs from the very start, entirely ignoring the initial, systematic microdosing approach the author had tried to take. It was a total, devastating disconnection from reality, where even the people closest to them couldn't understand the mechanics of how they fell so far.
So moving to Section 5, Inner Arbeit and Heiling, or the ascent and support. The obvious question is, how does one survive such a catastrophic psychological fall? Well, mirroring the earlier descent, the subsequent tracks map out the grueling climb back up.
The healing process is anchored mathematically right at track 20, which is Robert Miles' classic track Children. This song symbolizes a solemn internal vow to protect their own inner child after surviving such a severe trauma. The actual ascent out of the darkness begins with track 19, Eminem's Cleaning Out My Closet, which draws heavily on the raw, unfiltered resilience of the author's brother. But honestly, the true, undeniable safety net here is an incredible inner circle of strong women. We have Faylene, who graciously stepped in to take the author to a celebratory dinner when their own parents couldn't attend a graduation. We have Jewel, who provided much-needed validation and sparked deep ideas for a podcast, specifically addressing the epidemic of male loneliness. There's MJ and Charlie, who constantly modeled a fierce, unwavering anti-racism stance, and Joelle, who provided deep insights into systemic prejudice. Now, you might actually wonder why these specific, heavy conversations were so vital to a mental health recovery. Well, a psychosis fundamentally untethers you from society. It traps you in a completely subjective, paranoid, and terrifyingly lonely reality. Engaging deeply with real-world systemic issues, like racism and male isolation, acted as heavy psychological anchors. Engaging with these women and their grounded perspectives physically tethered the author back to a shared objective reality. It proved to them that the world outside their own shattered mind was still there. Still deeply flawed, sure, but definitely still worth engaging with.
Let's talk more about Joelle, a mixed-race woman the author met in Mallorca. She shared a startling and profoundly impactful childhood memory that further grounded the author in reality. She recalled being a young girl, maybe about 10 or 11 years old, and seeing a Muslim woman wearing a headscarf driving a pristine, very expensive sports car. Joelle's immediate, totally unprompted, internalized thought was, wow, how can they afford that? Joelle shared this story to impartially illustrate the slow, insidious nature of trained racism. It isn't always loud, it isn't always overtly malicious or violent. Sometimes it is atmospheric. It seeps into our subconscious from the media and the society around us, even affecting the thoughts of those within marginalized communities themselves. These quiet, highly reflective conversations were absolutely instrumental for the author. Recognizing how societal structures invisibly shape our everyday thoughts gave the author a concrete framework to understand how their own mind had been shaped and ultimately shattered, allowing for a much more deliberate, careful psychological reconstruction.
Finally, we arrive at Section 6, Manifestation of Enlightenment, or the final tracks. As the mirrored playlist nears its end, the author synthesizes all of these chaotic experiences into a very clear, forward-looking vision.
Tied to track 21, which is Café Del Mar's Energy, the author reflects deeply on their linguistic journey and how language intimately intertwines with mental health. While living in Palma, speaking Spanish was obviously essential, yet the author notes the immense cognitive load that was required to master its complex, heavily interwoven verb tenses. It was exhausting for a healing brain. In sharp contrast, they found learning Hebrew in Israel to be surprisingly intuitive and incredibly grounding. And that's primarily because Hebrew fundamentally relies on just 3 core tenses: past, present, and future. That's it. The author views this as a profound realization of how language actually shapes our thought processes. Think about it. After suffering a psychosis where your mind is totally overwhelmed by infinite paranoid possibilities and looping complexities, the refreshing grammatical simplicity of Hebrew essentially cleared the mental clutter. It allowed for a much more direct, energetic connection to the physical world, proving that complex emotional and spiritual ideas can often be effectively communicated with simple, present-focused structures. It was a vital step in their healing, simplifying the linguistic inputs to help stabilize the mental outputs.
In the final tracks, absolutely everything synthesizes. Track 22 perfectly mirrors track 12 from the very beginning, allowing the author to safely look back and finally reconcile their past chaos. They navigate old, lingering controversies, like the backlash they faced over wearing a sweater reading Shit Food Mongoland. Now, out of context, that sounds bad, but it was actually a piece of highly specific, albeit very un-PC, Berlin skate park slang. It was an inside joke, not a malicious attack. They are finally able to process this alongside their own visual creations, like a cat patched with the words "a deeper peace." They created this to neutrally critique the shifting political landscape they witnessed in Israel, where secular, peace-loving citizens find themselves increasingly marginalized by a rapidly rising tide of right-wing politics. The crucial thing here is that the author is no longer overwhelmed by these massive societal tensions. They are finally stable enough to just observe them. And that brings us at long last to track 23. While the rest of the playlist is a closed, perfectly mirrored loop, track 23 is the definitive exit door. It takes all the hard-won lessons learned from the descent and the ascent and transitions them from the abstract realm into the concrete world. This manifests in the conceptual design of the Roreal Skate Camp with 2 R's. It's a tangible, real-world vision of community, teaching, and resilience built directly on the ashes of their mental breakdown.
So, what does this all mean for us? The author took the absolute, paralyzing chaos of their existence, a fracturing family dynamic, a totally devastating psychosis in Palma, and profound, boundary-breaking spiritual awakenings in Israel, and they structurally balanced it. By intentionally matching every single painful descent with a corresponding mathematically precise ascent, they built an impenetrable framework for their own survival. So I leave you with this. If our lives are indeed a mirrored playlist of traumas and triumphs, how might structuring your own life's chaos into a symmetrical narrative empower your future? When you look back at your darkest, lowest moments, can you identify the subsequent tracks of healing that eventually pulled you out? And most importantly, what is the track 23 that will finally close your current loop, break the cycle, and transition you into your next era of enlightenment? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive today. Keep reflecting, keep learning, and I will catch you in the next explainer.